Good evening, folks, and welcome to Princeton Review and Tutor.com's AP Social Studies / History Strategy Session webinar. Um, we are of course just getting started. I see a lot of people are joining, and so I'm sure people will filter in quite a bit over the next few moments or so. My name is Ken Brenner. I've been with Princeton Review now for about 17 years. I am an AP tutor for all of the history, social studies, economics aligned type subjects. I'll be your principal guide through this evening. We are joined in the panel by Anna Richmond, our customer success specialist, who works with Tutor.com and the Princeton Review, trying to make sure that our clients have all of their needs met. The main way we'll be interacting tonight is through our Q&A. So I will be periodically stopping during the presentation to ask if there's questions. We'll also have a brief Q&A towards the end of this hour we have together. So if you don't ask your question during the meeting, you'll have another chance to ask it at the end. And we encourage you to enter your questions, not just when I stop for them, but really whenever the question occurs to you. So type it into the Q&A as soon as you have it, and Anna and I will make sure it gets addressed at the appropriate time. Lastly, just so everyone knows, this meeting is being recorded, and Anna can correct me if I'm wrong, but a copy of the recording will be emailed to you, I think 24 to 48 hours after the presentation, something like that. And Anna will correct me in the chat if I don't have that right. But thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. And we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to do, and we're sure that folks want to get through as much information as they can now that we've sort of reached the midpoint through our AP journey, right? As the calendar sort of starts to look at those exams getting closer. So the three central tenets of our presentation tonight are why somebody would take AP exams at all, which will help you kind of just align the importance of what you or your student are going through, understanding the format and structure of each of the different AP social studies exams, and preparing for the AP social studies exams. And so, and that's going to be us giving out some of our strategies and techniques for both the multiple choice questions across these tests, as well as the essay written portions of these tests. But we begin with why we would take AP exams at all. Many of you may know this answer. Others of you may have just been told to do an AP course this year by an advisor. The principal reason that people take AP exams is to earn college credit. And generally speaking, the way that works is you probably know the exams are scored out of 5. And at most institutions, you get credit for a 3 or higher. There are some very competitive schools that only give credit for a 4 or higher. But it isn't just about college credit, it's about what that credit does for you. If a school gets your score of either a 3 or higher or a 4 or higher and accepts that score, that counts as credit for a required course. So no matter what college you go to, you are generally going to be asked to do 2 core classes of math, of history, of science, of English, of language, of fine arts. Effectively, for many college students, the first year or 2 of college is almost like a 13th and 14th grade. Well, if you want to get to your major classes more quickly, AP exam credit can help you skip introductory classes. So if I get a qualifying score on APUSH, for example, that can help me bypass one of those 2 required history courses. And if I have not only a 3 or a 4 in APUSH, but also a 3 or a 4 in AP Euro from a different year, I can skip both of the introductory history courses required by almost every college on the planet. And the benefit of skipping introductory courses isn't just you're kind of not needing to repeat a little bit of what you did in high school. It also means that you might be getting to your major faster. So let's say you wanted to go to school, but you specifically want to go to school for film. Well, that means you really want to go in there and you want to learn about audio and video editing, and you want to learn about script writing, and you want to learn about the different aspects of video production. You don't necessarily want to do what you've done the last 4 years, which is rotate through all those liberal arts. The more credit you have through things like APs, the more of the introductory classes you skip, the more quickly you'll be doing film classes. And finally, while we at Princeton Review don't want to rob any of your college experience from you, the fact is that every group of 3 to 4 AP exams you've earned credit on can come very close to letting you graduate sooner. The average amount of college courses taken per semester is 4 to 5. Well, if you've got 4 to 5 sets of credits from APs, then you could graduate a semester or even a year early. And again, you might not want to end your college experience early, but if you're going to be doing things like taking out loans, graduating earlier will vastly reduce the amount of debt that you're facing after college, if that's part of your plan. So it turns out that it goes a lot deeper than just saying you can earn college credit. That really sort of snowballs into many, many benefits. So that is the reason, that's the principal reason we're taking AP exams. A side note for all of you, taking AP courses and doing well in those courses also looks good from a college admissions perspective as well. Now, there are many, many social studies related exams, and I didn't necessarily put all of them on these slides, but we put the vast majority of the things related to social studies. So that's history, government, economics are the big ones. You should note that every AP exam is offered just once per year. And that means that you need to make sure that you're all signed up to take these exams, because with the exception of, with the exception of like makeups for very specific circumstances, you need to use this one opportunity. So let's run through the dates together real quick. On Monday, May 5th, you have AP Euro and AP Microeconomics. Tuesday, May 6th is AP Human Geography and AP US Government and Politics. Wednesday, May 7th is AP Comparative Government and Politics. Thursday, May 8th is AP World History Modern. And Friday, May 9th is AP US History and AP Macroeconomics. So basically all of the social studies and history tests come up in that first week of APs rather than the second. And that's usually what they do each and every year. So let's talk about how all AP exams are scored for some additional insight. College Board uses this scoring metric to communicate to colleges how you, the student, performed in the subject matter. So if College Board grades your test at a 3 out of 5, they're saying to colleges, this student is qualified in this area. So if I get a 3 on AP World History Modern, College Board is saying, they're pretty qualified in their knowledge of this topic. It would be like they took a course at your college and got a B-, C+, or a C. A 4 is very well qualified, and you can see the equivalents on the chart. And a 5 is a perfect score. It is extremely well qualified. College Board is basically saying, if you put this student into this college course, they would get an A or an A+ in it. And so any school that takes these scores, is sort of agreeing with this assessment. That's why very competitive schools might only give credit for a 4 or a 5, because they don't want to just know that you're competent in the subject. If they're going to give you a pass on it, they want to know that you've mastered it. So that is the end of our first module. Why you would take AP exams and what the score means to a college. If you have any questions to this point, please go ahead and enter them into the Q&A. And we will move on to our next segment in just a few seconds here. I'm going to wait a moment and just see if anything comes in. But if you have any questions about anything in that first segment, something you want to know a little bit more about, just let me know. So we know why a student would want to take them. We also have now sort of hinted at why why they exist, and why colleges use them. The purpose of these exams is to show competency in the material covered by an introductory college course in the exam subject. It is literally a way for the college to say, yes, this student does not need to do one of our history courses because they've already shown to be very well qualified or extremely well qualified in AP World History Modern, as an example. Now, in order to assess knowledge, the exams aren't necessarily going to always focus on very minute details. All of the exams are going to focus on a series of big ideas. And so here you see the big ideas for APUSH, for AP US History. And we're not going to go through all of them, but just to give you an example, when we say something like migration and settlement, we don't mean that the college or the college board wants you to be able to show that you remember how one very specific little piece of the United States got settled on one particular day. They want to make sure you understand the broad strokes of how who would be future Americans arrived on the continent, and how they slowly achieved manifest destiny by going west. So just be aware that we say big ideas for a reason. These tests are always tests of understanding the larger pieces of each era of, in this case, American history, and not random things like military trivia or battles. So here are the big 8 ideas for APUSH: American and national identity, work exchange and technology, geography and the environment, and so on. If you instead are doing AP Euro, your big ideas are different. Of course, they're more Europe centric. So if we take an answer like objective knowledge and subjective visions, that area is sort of a test of, do you understand, right? Like, do you understand what was agreed upon being universally true, and then what was specific to each European nation state or religion? Technological and scientific innovation is, what were the major innovations in these areas? And again, you're not going to be tested on the specific date that one invention came around. You're being tested on what were the broad strokes of how the railway revolutionized Europe. And again, that's getting very modern. So a lot of it is more trade routes and things like that. But again, just so you see these, and then we'll move on. The AP World big ideas, these zoom out even more, right? So how different groups of developing human cultures interacted with the environment, how the culture of those groups developed over time, the different governance that was formed in regions of the world like Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. What were the different economic systems that developed? What were the different ways society was organized and how different classes interacted? And finally, again, technologically and innovation. So I think we get the idea. I won't keep making the same point on each one of these. If you are doing one of the government exams go, as you might expect. The US government goes much more specifically about these 5 principles: foundations of American democracy, how the 3 branches of government interact with each other, civil liberties and civil rights, American political ideologies and beliefs, and political participation, like to what extent the regular populace participates in all different political and democratic and voting matters. I don't have comparative government on there, but effectively, instead of American democracy, comparative government is, again, comparing different systems of government and different ways of organizing government structures across different nations. Then, if you're doing one of the economics exams, you're going to notice that microeconomic focuses much more about individual products and like how the choices behind a product sort of drive the behavior of the market. So it's going to do a little bit more with like costs and benefits, whereas macroeconomic is going to deal with the larger economic picture, how one country's policy might affect another's and how we measure the strength of a country's economy. Now, all of your history exams, so that's APUSH, AP Euro, and AP World, will follow the structure you see on screen. So, Section 1 will be 60% of your score. Part A of Section 1 is 55 multiple choice questions. That's 40% of the score. And the way that these are organized, folks, is you're going to get some document or picture, graphic, quotation, excerpt, and then a series of roughly 3 to 5 questions regarding that document. And usually what these sets will do is they'll sort of go forward in history, and then they'll kind of, so you might get a passage, if you're doing American history, maybe you'll get a passage about the 1600s, then a passage about the late 1700s, then the early 1800s, then the late 1800s, and finally the 1930s. Then you might cycle back to the 1690s and repeat that. There's not that many questions about the period of salutary neglect, but you get the idea. For all of the tests, this is true, where they each passage sort of moves forward in chronological order, and then it kind of resets to earlier in history. Section 1, Part B is 40 minutes and 3 short answer questions, each one of these being 20% of the score. And so these are like, you're sort of answering the question in like one well-written paragraph. And then Section 2 of the exam is 40% of the score. You have 1 hour and 40 minutes total, which includes a suggested 15-minute reading period. And what you use those 15 minutes on is reading the different source documents as part of your DBQ, your document-based question. That's 25% of the score. We'll talk more about that in a bit. And then you have a long essay where you get to choose one prompt from 3 different prompts, and that's 15% of the score. And again, all 3 history exams follow this structure. Then, if you're doing U.S. government or comparative government, U.S. government is 1 hour and 20 for 55 multiple choice. That's half of the score. Comparative government is 1 hour. Section 2 is 1 hour 40 minutes for 50% of the score, where you're doing 4 free response questions, concept application, quantitative analysis, SCOTUS comparison, an argument essay. On comparative government, you have 1 hour and 30 minutes, so 10 fewer minutes, and that is because one of your tasks is a little bit less involved, and that is that you don't do a SCOTUS comparison, you just do what is called the comparative essay. So comparative government, you have a little bit less time, but on both tests, multiple choice is half of the score, essays are half of the score. And finally, for my economics folks, both tests are the same. You have 1 hour and 10 minutes for Section 1. That is 60 multiple choice and 66% of the score. So when we do our multiple choice skills today, that matters a lot for you folks. It's a bigger component. And then Section 2 is 1 hour with a suggested 10-minute reading period, where you're doing a longer free response question and 2 shorter free response questions. And those are going to provide some graphs, some information, some data that you're going to use and must address in your responses of whatever those economic-based prompts are. So all of these tests are designed to do 2 things. One, they're designed definitely to put you in time pressure, to be able to show mastery of the topic in limited time. And 2, they're showing a blend of skills. You need to be able to answer multiple choice questions, but you also need to be able to write on the topic. You're not going to be able to get a 5 without showing some level of mastery of both of these. Now, what we're really here for tonight, and where I'm going to spend the next half hour or so, is on strategy, right? The idea of how do we actually prepare for these exams. And the reason we run these webinars is your teacher is probably doing a very good job of giving you content, but that isn't everything you need to do well on the AP exam. It might be enough for their course, but not for the separate exam, which has really nothing to do with your grade in the course. So let's work on the exams themselves. Now, a lot of my examples tonight are going to come from the history tests. That is because, generally speaking, most people watching this presentation more will be doing history than they will be doing the government exams or the economic exam. But every strategy I'm discussing is relevant to all levels of social studies AP. So please be aware that these skills matter for all of you, regardless of which test you're doing. First, let's talk about how we're going to handle the multiple choice sections, because these questions range from 50 to 66% of your score. So no matter, even if you're a little bit nervous about the essay side of things, doing well on the multiple choice side, really well, reduces how great your essays need to be. So first, we talk about some global strategies. Global strategies are, and we'll go into them, but global strategies are the things that apply to every standardized test, whether it's AP or not. We'll go through a few of them together. Then you need to familiarize yourself with question types. Across all of these tests, there are a couple of different ways that College Board will ask its questions. Each one should be handled slightly differently. You therefore need to know what technique you would use on a given type of problem. And lastly, you need to understand what AP's reasoning skills are and how they change the way you need to solve each of the individual problems. So let's start with a global technique. The first global technique you need to use across all of the social studies exams is process of elimination. Many of you probably know that POE is getting rid of wrong answers. You need to understand that there are hundreds of meaningful events that happened in AP World or Euro or US history. There are dozens of different concepts that affect economics, many different important laws and acts that are part of government. So the odds that you just know the answer to every question are low. However, and here's an example. If I ask all of you a geography question, what is the capital of Malawi? You probably don't know that answer off the top of your head. But if I give you 4 answers, Paris, London, Amsterdam, and Lilongwe, everyone watching this or watching this later is probably shouting out D. And it isn't because you know that Lilongwe is correct. It's because you know that it's not Paris, London, or Amsterdam. And so whenever you get one of these questions, the way to tackle it 100% of the time is by striking out the 3 flawed answers on these questions. We'll look more at that in a moment. So POE is very, very important because you might not know the right answer to every question, but you can always eliminate at least some of the answers. However, you might not be able to get rid of all of them. That certainly does show up as like a little bit of a question mark, right? So what do we do in that scenario? What about if we're in, sorry, I apologize. Oh, I see. Okay. Let me go back there. What do we do if we're in that scenario where we aren't quite sure, or rather we we have a problem and we're not quite sure how to answer it, right? Well, there is something that we can definitely do in that scenario. And the strategy here is to use something that we call letter of the day. So letter of the day works like this. And it might, let me see if it, I apologize for what I changed, folks. Let me just try to fix that. There we go. That was what I wanted. So letter of the day works like this. If you ever have a question where you aren't sure what answer to put, you don't want to leave questions blank because you're not ever like considered to be wrong on a question. So how do we guess? Well, if I guess randomly, as I'm doing over here, the problem here is twofold, right? The problem is you could theoretically guess randomly in such a way that every question you miss. But the other problem is guessing randomly isn't really random. If you guess randomly, you still might sit there and try to think of a good guess. Not only is that going to cost you time, but you're very likely going to talk yourself into the wrong answer. So for every multiple choice question you get to where you just have no idea, we recommend choosing a consistent letter at the start of the exam, in this case B, and filling that letter in every time. And the benefits here are twofold. Literally, you have a better chance of getting at least a few questions right. But the major benefit is that you don't spend time. And that is the key here. When you get to a problem where for some reason you can't answer it, nor can you eliminate all three wrong answers, putting in B makes you move forward to questions that you do know what to do. So let's take a look at the next piece of our strategy. Let's get a little bit more specific with the multiple choice questions then. What you're going to get, as I mentioned, for all of the history exams is an excerpt, right? As well as some questions about it. So here there's going to be 3 questions connected from this excerpt from John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. One of the most common sources excerpts you would get is a primary source, something directly from some notable historical figure. The thing is, you don't necessarily want to just read this and assume that that's going to be enough to give you the answer. Instead, what you want to do is note one thing, which is, where are we in American history? We are in the 1960s. And so the answers to the questions will be things that are true of what was going on in the US in the 1960s. So the excerpt discusses global turbulence and the desire for freedom of mankind in reference to which of the following amounts? Well, look at these options. The Great Depression is not in the 1960s. There are multiple different women's suffrage movements, but both women's suffrage and civil rights, although these are ongoing through much of the 20th century, don't connect to the idea of global turbulence. And so the biggest picture event that's associated with this speech is the Cold War. And notice, I only need to focus on these keywords in the question and not so much the actual prompt. So when you are given a primary source document, understand that who's saying it and when it was said can be more important than the actual context of the document. Now, another type of format, so that is how we handle our standard question format. We use when in history the document came from and keywords in the question to attempt to avoid having to read every word of the document. Now, another question format you might get off a primary source is an accept, least, not question. The author indicates that all the following led to the Russian Revolution of 1917, except. Well, if I say except, I know that I'm looking for the one answer that's wrong. Therefore, 3 of these answers are right. You don't need to be an expert on this, but you just need to know loosely what happened in European history for 1917. This is definitely part of World War One. World War One's 1914 to 1919, and the Russian Revolution is definitely in that span. We know that the Russian Revolution, you may or may not know, definitely has a lot to do with classes feeling like they are not being treated properly. And then between B and D, you may not be sure, but look at D carefully. This says a decline in the rate of industrialization. If you know your European or your US or your world history, you know that industrialization is not declining in this era. It is very much rapidly increasing. So this is my outlier. And it turns out, yes, there was a failure of autocratic government in Russia. But regardless of that, the answer is D. Notice there's supposed to be a passage here. I don't need to understand that if I know where I am in time. So the strategy is, if you're doing an accept, least, not question, we put a yes either on the booklet if it's a paper test, or on scratch paper if it's an online test. And we put a yes next to the answers we know are right, a no next to the answer that we know is the odd man out, and we pick the no. Now, another type of question you may get on these exams is a political cartoon. So in this political cartoon, we have a caption here, right? Hannah McKinley making a quote. And again, we just need to ask ourselves where we are in US history. Notice I'm going back and forth between the histories here. So let's take a look. The political cartoon above implies that. Well, let's look at these options. I know the quote is Hannah to McKinley, right? And it's like, better to be president than be right. So if we look here, A, McKinley was the first president to favor big business interests openly. Nothing about your quote was specifically about big interests. B, by the 1890s, Henry Clay's political approach had lost favor with the electorate. You know, that might actually be true, but it's not part of what's going on in the cartoon. All we know is that Hannah's calling Clay a rude name, not necessarily something this specific. C, his presidential campaign was masterminded by Marcus Hannah. Maybe, because Hannah is saying something to McKinley, and he's literally saying to McKinley, the president, it's better to be president than to be right. So maybe Hannah had something to do with McKinley's presidency. But D is crazy. Marcus Hannah single-handedly controlled all 3 branches of the federal government. If at any point Marcus Hannah was in control of all 3 branches of the federal government, you would probably have heard about that in AP US history. So the answer is definitely C. So again, I'm really using my context clues for this question type, and I'm using what's called era-based reasoning. Figure out what era of history you're in, and if you know the big things that were happening at that time, you can get these problems correct. Another thing you may see, this is more on the history exams than like economics, although many of the economics multiple choice do have pictures, is you might get a map instead of a cartoon. So here we have, right, Ibn Battuta's and Marco Polo's 13th and 14th century travels. The dotted line is Marco Polo. The solid line is Ibn Battuta. Got it. So look at the question asked about this map then. According to the map, how do the voyages compare? A, Marco Polo began his journey before Ibn Battuta. If you just look at the title, you know that's wrong because Ibn Battuta is connected, with the 13th century, and Marco Polo in that respective order would be later. So it's definitely not choice A. B, Ibn Battuta spent considerable time on the Swahili coast while that area was largely avoided by Marco Polo. Going back, if I look for the Swahili coast, I do see that the solid line, Ibn Battuta, let me circle it for you, goes there. Marco Polo doesn't. So I like that answer. C, unlike Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo's voyage explored various ports in China. Not true. You're going to see that they both explored areas of China. Oops, sorry, folks. And then the last one is also wrong. Ibn Battuta's voyage took him through Islamic lands, unlike the voice of Marco Polo. You don't need to be a geography expert. You need to know that Islamic lands are in here somewhere, and they both lines go through that area. So, with that being said, the answer that we definitely like here is B. You did not need to know one thing about either of these gentlemen to answer that question. That's the important takeaway I want you to have. Lastly, these questions can certainly also have charts or tables. And again, understand that while multiple answers may be right, only one of them will be supported by the graph. And so if you look here, a little bit of jumping back and forth, what can be drawn from the graph above? A, Eisenhower was the most consistently popular president in the nation's history. Well, if I look at the picture, I don't see how that's possible because Kennedy's numbers in popularity were all higher. So we're going to go with no, right? Kennedy received greater congressional support for his program. I have no idea because whether that's true or not, it's not in my chart. Nixon's approval rating was the result of the Watergate scandal. You know, Nixon's approval rating does get pretty low there. Sorry, 24. But I have no idea from the chart that that's because of Watergate, even though, yeah, it was because of Watergate. So D, the difference between Johnson's highest and lowest was the greatest for any president. And if I go back one more time, right? Sure. The difference between Johnson's highest and lowest was actually greatest. It was 44 right here, which is greater than anyone else's gap, even Nixon's. So this is not trying to tell all of you as students, and we'll move on from multiple choice in a moment. This is not telling you you don't need to study and do your notes. This is telling you that a lot of this comes down to looking at your questions very carefully and understanding what clues you get from the question or the date or setup of the source data more than it is scouring a passage very clearly and trying to remember everything you can remember about the various history. So let's make sure that we're not cutting our time off too much. There's a few more questions here about, again, I just took from different exams about multiple choice, but I do want to talk about non-multiple choice things. So the history tests all have short answers, and that's going to help lead us into a discussion of long answer or essay questions in a moment as well. Your strategy here is, first, we're going to give a quick overview of these questions. We're going to take you through a basic approach to doing a short answer question, and we're going to show you a sample response. So, all three history exams it asks you to do 3 of 4 short answer questions. 2 of them will give you an element of choice, which allow you to pick the topic or theme you feel best about. All of them are going to be tied to some primary source, historical argument, data, map, or some general aspect of the associated history. These are short answers, so you are not required to answer the question with an argument. You are only required to provide evidence and factual data. So you get 40 minutes, and the basic approach for each of the three questions you choose works out to you have about 13 minutes for each one. And we recommend you spend about 3 minutes brainstorming and 10 minutes writing. The steps are: start with the one prompt that fits your knowledge base the best. In the thinking step, write down everything you know about the topic. And then each of your essays should be 2 to 3 paragraphs, although each paragraph only needs to be a couple of sentences. So let me show you a little bit of an example of that. Here we have, as an example, right? Convinced that the revolution was the work of a full few miscreants who had rallied an armed rabble to their cause, they expected that the revolutionaries would be intimidated. Then the vast majority of Americans who were loyal but cowed by the terrorist tactics would rise up, kick out the rebels, and restore loyal government in each colony. Jeremy Black, Christ of Empire, Britain, America in the 18th century. So we know that we are talking about the 1700s, and we are talking about the American Revolution against the British. So we were asked to answer parts A, B, and C. Briefly explain one example of rebellion during the time period described in Black's quote, and then give one cause of the rebellion you chose and one effect of the rebellion you chose. So the first thing we're going to do is choose, right? And I might say the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, Revenue Act, the Sugar Act, and the Tea Act, right, are all different acts of that engendered some type of rebellion. Well, which one maybe was the most strong in response from the colonies and the British? Let's say you chose the Tea Act of 1773. You would write down the major things you remember about the Tea Act. So you have the East India Tea Company, the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty, the Intolerable Acts, which were issued in response, the closing of Boston Harbor. And so what someone might do in the 3 minutes where they sort of came and they thought about what act and rebellion associated with that act and their little brainstorming might write this. And this is about as long as you'd ever want a short answer to be. No arguments here, straight answers to the questions. So I'm just going to highlight a little bit here just so people can kind of see this. The very first thing we have is we explain one situation, right, of the act of rebellion. And so we explain the Boston Tea Party as we explain the Boston Tea Party and we explain its cause. So we've actually done 2 of the 3 points in one paragraph, right? You've given me the act of rebellion and you've given me the cause of that, which was the Tea Act of 1773. The final 2 sentences here are, or 3 sentences are, what was the one effect of it? And one effect of it was the passing of the Intolerable Acts, which, as a matter of fact, did more to provoke the American Revolution than if they had just ignored the Boston Tea Party. If you do some counting here, folks, there are 6 sentences here, and that is enough to have explained each one. And please focus on that. You are not asked to argue anything, just to explain. So we go on to explain that while you have to do questions 1 and 2, you always get to choose between questions 3 and 4. Although, again, even 1 and 2 give elements of choice. You need to know the time period, but you get to pick what from that period you're talking about. In 3 and 4, this is just showing you an example, right? Where this is what a 3 might look like. Confine your response 1600 to 1800, talking about different settling and colonizing, or different immigration policies from the 20th century. All of you will have studied enough to be able to answer one of those. And keep in mind, this comes after the multiple choice for APUSH, for AP Euro, for AP World. So you probably might have been refreshed on some of these things in the multiple choice section. Now, I want to make sure we don't run out of time to give some information about the DBQs, the long essay strategy, and these will be part of the FRQs you have to do for the government exams and the economics exam as well. We'll do an overview, we'll run through our basic approach, and we'll show you a sample question. I'll try to do all of that before we stop for our Q&A. And remember, if you have any questions at all, feel free to put them in the Q&A at any moment. The DBQ on each of the 3 history exams is usually a great source of stress. Your job is going to be to interpret primary source documents that could come from newspaper articles, letters, diaries, speeches, legislation, political cartoons, charts, graphs, folklore, poems, traditions, all of that. Usually, there are no more than 7 documents in a DBQ. There's almost always 7. We have seen 6 before. Now, we're going to give you an example, right, of what was seen on a previous, this is a Euro test. So this was, you were asked to discuss and evaluate problems between the English and the Irish in 1800 to 1916. And so what you had was a quote from an English prime minister, a parliamentary speech by a Protestant Irish leader, a poem written in 1842 by an Irish nationalist, an article in the English Conservative Party newspaper, a declaration of principles from the National Land League, a piece of writing from 1900 by Maud Gonne, founder of the Daughters of Ireland, and finally a map showing the distribution in the 1901 of Protestants and Roman Catholics. So these are the documents that you would use part or all of the included reading period to read through. You must understand that there is no right answer to each DBQ. As long as you make an argument, support your argument with evidence both from the documents and not from the documents, you can argue anything. Graders take into account the strength of your argument and the evidence offered. And on top of that, you should know that the highest scores only come with outside information. And there's always at least 1 point given for including something about the topic that wasn't present in the documents themselves, which in a moment will lead into our basic approach. Here is the scoring for the DBQ. You're going to notice that you get 1 point for having a thesis or a claim. You should actually have an argument. And it's got to be 1 to 2 sentences that are located in the introduction or the conclusion, preferably both. You get a point if you can describe the background events that led into your argument or period, or what happened after it. You can get 3 points. And notice you get 1 point for using at least 3 of the documents and 2 points for at least using 6 of them. So there's a clue to all of you. Use 6 documents minimum, and you need at least 1 piece of historical evidence that is not found in the documents. Finally, you get 1 point, not just, you don't get the point for mentioning, if you can talk about the document's point of view, purpose, historical situation, or audience, like who the speaker of the document was and why they might have said what they said, that's a point. And finally, there's this last point for historical development. And usually that can be earned by connecting and grouping the documents in different ways. And all of this will be part of our basic approach. So let's get into that. Hold on. Let's get rid of this. So if we look, you need to first make sure that you read your question carefully. You need to make sure that you use 6 of the 7 documents, and you need to show that you understand the meaning of those documents. You need to make sure that you're keeping into account the tone. And really, a big part of the strategy then is to try to organize your documents into groups and then write each of your body paragraphs about one of these document groups. For example, let me go back for a moment. You may have noticed that I have one thing here about Irish Protestants and Catholics. That's document 3. And then over here, document 7 is also about Protestants and Catholics. That could be one group that you discuss as part of a body paragraph. So that's an example of what I mean by grouping. The documents, a big point here then is to make sure you understand the point of view and understand what is a more credible document than another. So the goal is to create at least 3 groupings. And remember, those it could be 3 groupings of 2 documents each. Even better is if 2 of your groupings actually use the same document, but they use it in different ways. Make sure that you built a thesis. A thesis is not a restate of a question. It answers the question, and it provides a specific argument and directly says what the groupings you're going to be using are. And remember, you need to use outside examples. So this segment here, which I just want to stay on for a moment so people can screenshot it, we'll talk about how you might group documents. It gives some tips for doing that. You'll be able to see this in the recording as well. And then here's sort of how someone might tackle a DBQ. And I am keeping an eye on the clock. So let's look at this together. Using the documents and your knowledge of European history, discover Napoleon was a supporter of the ideas espoused in the Enlightenment or whether he was an enemy of individual liberty. Before you look at any documents, so don't even use the reading period yet, you need to write down what you know about this topic. If you read the documents first, you're not going to get the point for outside information because you're going to come up with something you think is outside, but isn't really. So what this person did was they wrote down all the ideas of enlightenment they could remember, and then they tried to recall if Napoleon was for it or against it. They took about 2 to 3 minutes brainstorming. This gathering evidence step is the second thing you do after reading the question. They wrote 4 ideas of enlightenment: religious tolerance, rational government, the equality of individuals, and the freedom from repression. And they said, you know, Napoleon did actually give a lot of expanded religious freedom throughout the empire. There were things that were better at him for certain religious groups than they had been prior. Rational government. He had introduced the Napoleonic Code, and he had made more aspects of government centralized so they could be things can be handled down more consistency. He also favored meritocracy. He favored advancing people based on their merits. You can also see that the person wrote cons for some of the things he did against those bottom 2 areas. This is very, very powerful, and it's something that you can do in the first 2 to 3 minutes. Then, when you go to read the documents, that's your third step, by the way. So read the question, brainstorm everything you know about the question outside of the document. Step 3, read the documents. Know that the documents may appear in chronological order, and if not, they are organized to be able to compare and contrast different viewpoints. So they might have a viewpoint from a male speaker explaining about how traditional household roles are good, and then from a female speaker saying that people should be assigned to the job they're suited for regardless of sex or gender. Watch out for inconsistencies within and among the documents. Every time you can see that 2 documents disagree, those documents should be grouped together. Make sure you understand who the different sources of the documents are, because that's going to affect your grouping as well. And make sure that if something goes directly against your argument For instance, if you say Napoleon was more of an advocate for the ideas of the Enlightenment than a detractor, you need to make sure you're going to address each document that shows him as a detractor. And so that's what this slide is showing about, talking about counter evidence. You always get, this is how you can earn the point for historical development, by directly discussing things that are counter to your document. Do not ignore the documents that are counter to your thesis. And then there is the long essay. I won't spend as much time because this is more like a traditional school essay. The rubric is the same, except the evidence is different because you're not grouping documents. You just get pieces. It's you using your examples to support an argument. The challenge with the long essay is that all of it needs to come from your memory. And so make sure that you're choosing the question that you know the most specific details about it. And then the steps are very straightforward. Analyze the question so you know exactly what you need to reply. Assess what you know about the topic and devise a thesis. Remember, you shouldn't choose the side you like better. You should choose the side of the argument you know more about. If you have time, write an outline of how you organize it, and then write. And again, I know that's simplifying things, but the basic idea is to, just like with the DBQ, understand what the question is asking, write down what you know about the topic, organize it if you have time, and then write your essay using a very traditional introduction, 3 body paragraphs, conclusion structure. While the best way to succeed on an APA exam is knowing the content, AP exams are still standardized tests, and you need to know how to beat a standardized test. What you saw in the seminar this evening was some of the big picture strategies we teach students. And you'd be amazed at how many students have studied the content, but don't even have the basic plan we showed you tonight for doing the DBQ or the essay. So with the time that we have here, right? I certainly want to, A, thank everyone for being here, and B, if you have a question about tonight's content you'd like to ask, we've got a few minutes still where we can take some questions as a Q&A. And thank you for everyone for following that, because that was a lot to do in a single hour or 58 minutes. So if you have any questions at all, enter them in the Q&A, and then I will get to them as quickly as we can.
Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing your expertise with all of us today. I know all of our attendees are working very hard to prepare for these exams, and absolutely appreciate you taking the time to go over this tonight. And I do see that question in the Q&A as well.
Yes.
Could you please explain the format of a DBQ?
Sure. So, Finn, the format of a document-based question will be that you're going to get the prompt like the ones I showed you before of Napoleon. You're going to get 6 to 7 source documents after that. Your essay format should be as follows. In your opening body paragraph, you should explain your specific stance on the argument in 1 to 2 very clear sentences. And it must be a defensible stance, meaning something that someone could disagree with. In that same introduction, then, you must describe what your 3 groupings are. So you might say, Napoleon was much more of an ally of Enlightenment ideas than despite some conflicting evidence. And this can be looked at by viewing his contributions from 3 distinct areas: his treatment of the organization of government, his treatment of individual liberties, and his treatment and his treatment of religious groups. And so what you're telling the author is your documents will be grouped by ones that are relevant to the organization of government, ones that are related to individual citizen liberties, and ones that relate to the treatment of religious groups, right? And then you're going to give me 3 body paragraphs where one of them is each one of your groupings, making sure that you specifically call out anything that is counter to your point and explain why it's not that big of a deal or acknowledge it as a counter. Then you should have a conclusion that basically says, this evidence clearly supports my thesis. You're going to restate your thesis with a more stronger tone. So 5 paragraphs, introduction, 3 body paragraphs, each discussing a grouping, conclusion.
Thank you. And
Yeah,
how
go
much
ahead.
time should a student spend reading the DBQ documents themselves? And do you have any tips for how to skim them quickly?
Yes. You should spend no more than 15 minutes reading the DBQ documents. And Emily, what I would do is almost all of these documents have an attribution. They have the speaker and where they're from and when the document was given. So many, many, many times you can skim the documents by doing 2 things. One, just look at the attribution, because that's probably going to give you some direct evidence as to the point of view of the speaker or the topic. And 2, look for any mention of proper nouns. Proper nouns stand out more than regular words do, and they're going to help you understand if the person referenced any major groups or acts or laws or parties that are going to be relevant to the discussion. So 15 minutes or less. And if you need to skim, if you're looking to skim, attributions like the little note of who said it and the proper nouns in the document itself, that should help you group the documents fairly quickly.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ken. And we will stick around for about another minute. If there are any other questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, Ken, again, thank you so much for your time this evening. For all of you who are joining us from a Tutor.com partnership, if you have follow-up questions as well, you can log in to your school or local libraries Tutor.com program and work with one of our amazing AP tutors on your prep. And we thank you all for joining us tonight.
Perfect.
I do see one more question in the Q&A. What is the best way to analyze pictures that might be in a DBQ?
So, Rahid, the best way that we want to analyze pictures depends on what type of picture it is. But if you have a map, all you care about at first is the title and key legend of the map. If you have a table, all you care about is the title and the headings of the columns. If you have a political cartoon, all you care about at first is its caption and year. Am I missing any major pictures? No. Why? Because what you don't want to do is look at all the data on the map, look at all the numbers in the table, or look at all the details of the picture, because you aren't being asked to remember that data specifically. The reason we focus on titles, captions, names of variables, keys, and legends is you only need to know what's going on in the picture to reference it as the answer choices come up. So make sure that you're spending a very small amount of time looking at the features I talked about. If you need to look more deeply at the picture, like we did with Marco Polo and even Batuta, the answers will make that clear. So title, key and legend, captions, dates, not any of the actual data in the picture. That is not what you're being tested on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.